So I walked in and Mark Laaser, our wonderful family, blessed memory, he he sat there and he had his little cardigan on, which, that felt so stereotyped for a counselor to be wearing a cardigan. And he listened to my story and I'm sobbing my way and nobody's ever heard me tell this story. And it's the worst story the world has ever heard. I can't believe it. So much shame. And he's just sitting there. And I remember him pulling out he had diabetes and he pulled out a little candy as his sister. And that was actually for me this moment of he's heard 1,001 stories like this.
Yeah.
And he is not afraid of my story. And being in a room with someone else who was not afraid of the things that terrified me most, that was a huge moment of, I don't have to be so afraid of my terrors.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Everett, your co-host, and we are here today with our usual host, Dr. Greg Miller. Greg, it's great to see you. How you doing?
I'm doing well. This time I just happen to be in Chicago, not in the studio, but it's
Well,
great
that's
to be
why,
with you.
yeah, that's why we're doing this one via Zoom. And our special guest today, we went all the way down to Tennessee to find an expert in the field. It's Faithful and True's own Josh Moon. Josh, it's great to see you. How are you this
Yeah,
morning?
I'm well. Thank you, Randy. Thank you.
Good. Well, we're excited to be with you today on today's podcast, where Josh and Greg specifically are going to talk about fear and courage, and specifically courage in recovery. Greg, I'll let you take it from there.
Okay, sounds great. Well, one of the things that we often teach the men who come to our workshop is that recovery will take courage.
Mm.
That recovery is moving towards the things that we've been avoiding, acknowledging the things that maybe we want to deny. And so, anytime we're doing that, it's going to take courage, and we must be willing to face our fears. Well, specifically, I'm glad that Josh is with us. For those of you that know Josh from our team, his background is in biblical studies and theology. And so I thought it would be great for us to have a conversation of kind of the understanding of fear and courage from a biblical perspective and a theological perspective, and then interpret that through a recovery lens. And so, Josh, we're glad that you're here. And so to just start with, how did you see the importance of courage in your own recovery journey? Let's
Yeah.
just start there.
Yeah, it's a really important subject for me. Like fear is a thing that I know from the inside. And I always like to tell guys when I first meet with them, kind of the courage it takes. There's a certain kind of courage it takes to make an appointment at Faithful and True, to
Right.
walk through the doors, to show up for the appointment. Like there's a courage in it, even when it feels like desperation. Desperation isn't actually an active work. It's courage to
Hmm.
face into that fear. And I remember that uh, just very keenly, even though in my story, by the time I walked into Faithful and True, that was kind of, I felt like that was my last hope. Now, we can feel that in truth and debate about that, but
Right.
it certainly felt like my last hope. And I had no idea the amount of courage it would take. And what's also true, the enormity of courage for my wife in her recovery, in
Hmm.
her being able to receive my story. So courage has been an enormous subject for both of us in our recovery work.
Yeah. You talked about this idea of just coming to faithful and true takes courage. I often talk about the threshold of vulnerability, just
Mm.
stepping into the space, crossing that threshold. You're stepping into the unknown, and it does take courage to do that. And one of the things that we talk about at the workshop is that we have to be safe enough that we're willing to risk enough that we can be transformed enough that we're willing to try it again. And in there, that risking enough is about courage. And so every time we're invited to a risk, there is the courage it takes to engage the risk. And there's also the fear that becomes a barrier to engaging the risk. And so, from a theological perspective, that's kind of a biblical perspective, We know that fear is mentioned in the Bible. We're taught that we are to fear God, but we're also told, fear not, I am with you. We're told that perfect love casts out fear. So, in a variety of different ways, fear is acknowledged as a part of the human condition. What would you want our listeners to understand is we engage fear? Is fear the enemy? Is fear something we're supposed to avoid? Or is it just, in my language, is it something that we steward when we experience it?
That's right. Well, I think fear is something that is part of the human condition. It's part of what is good. And in theological terms, so Thomas Aquinas, one of the great theologians of the church, he actually puts it, fear springs from love.
Mm,
That fear is actually a thing that springs from love. And so actually it goes so far as he's saying fearlessness, like an absolute fearlessness, is sin because it shows insufficient love. So if my kid's running down the highway and there's cars and I say, I'm not afraid of anything. I think most of us would look at that and say, yeah, that
right,
expresses insufficient. So fear in itself, or fear by itself, uh, it's actually springs from love. The things that we love are actually what spur fear. They create this experience of fear when me with the things that I love rub against certain conditions in the world. Fear is the natural emotion that ought to come for
right,
somebody like me with the loves that I have, whether they're right or wrong loves. And so fear is a thing fear is a thing we can't afford to be afraid of
right. Yeah.
because
Well, and
it's
I would
so
also
easy to
say,
be
kind of
afraid
like,
of fear.
one of the things that I talk about is that fear and anxiety are like warning lights on the dashboard telling us that we perceive ourselves as unsafe. And like
Mm,
you said, to be fearless, to have no fear is actually a dangerous way to live.
yeah.
And so the idea is paying attention to that idea of perception. Just because I perceive I'm unsafe doesn't mean that I am unsafe. But what can also be true is just because I perceive myself as safe doesn't mean that I am.
Right.
And
Right.
so fear is that awareness. And then I have to discern, am I actually unsafe in this moment? And for many of us in childhood, it got confusing and we began to fear things that legitimately we did not need to fear. And then we actually begin to feel safe in places that were
Right.
unsafe. So our fear radar is distorted. And so we have
Right.
to sometimes discern this thing I'm fearing. Is it something that is actually fearful?
That's right. That's right. And it's this dynamic. So I played a lot of sports growing up. I love sports and um, the dynamic of I loved sports, so I played it. And what's also true is there were times when I was so afraid of not being chosen, not being
Mhm.
picked on the team. And so you would kind of that risk strategy is already at play as a child. Do I walk onto the court and play? And I'm doing a calculus in my head. Now I'm not able to articulate this, but I'm looking at the court and they're picking teams. And I actually remember having the thought, I don't want to step out there because I'm not going to be chosen first or second or third. And so my love of playing actually was inhibited by a disordered fear that was entirely about just this love of my own. I don't know, it wasn't really a reputation, but really a fear that I was being rejected and interpreting
Mhm.
not being chosen first as a rejection. And so structuring my life around fear in all of these little tiny ways that actually did end up impacting addiction life for me.
Absolutely. Well, and one of the things I was introduced to this idea that there are two broad fears. One of the fears is fear of rejection, and one of the fears is the fear of being crushed.
Mm,
So the fear of rejection or fear of loneliness is a relational fear. Fear of being crushed is about power. And so as we're evaluating or understanding our fears, we can kind of see in this circumstance, I'm afraid of being crushed by someone who has power. Maybe it's someone who has institutional power. Maybe it's the relational power of the bully. Maybe it's the power of influence. And I'm afraid that their power will be used against me. But then there's also just that fear, like you're saying, of not being included, of not being chosen. And it does create chaos. What's also true is sometimes we have fear in both circumstances. So, for instance, let's say that I go and I want to play the game. And so I'm afraid I'm not going to be chosen, and I desperately want to be chosen. But at the same time, if I'm chosen and I'm put on the court, I'm afraid I'm not going to be successful. So I'm afraid to play and I'm afraid not to play.
That's right.
I'm afraid to be chosen. I'm afraid not to be chosen. And that's where we can really get stuck and become paralyzed because it feels like either decision, either direction is still being defined by our fear.
Yeah. No,
Say,
that's right.
Josh, can I ask, when you're talking about walking in the doors at Faithful and True way back when, do you recall how long the fear existed with you?
Well, it actually, for me, uh, different aspects existed for a couple of years.
Okay.
And fear is an ongoing reality, something that I still have to face into and decide what to do with it, how to steward it. Um, but for me, so I walked in and Mark Laaser, our wonderful family, blessed memory, he he sat there and he had his little cardigan on, which, that felt so stereotyped for a counselor to be wearing a cardigan. And he listened to my story and I'm sobbing my way and nobody's ever heard me tell this story. And it's the worst story the world has ever heard. I can't believe it. So much shame. And he's just sitting there. And I remember him pulling out one, he had diabetes and he pulled out a little candy as his sister. And that was actually for me this moment of he's heard 1,001 stories like this.
Yeah.
And he is not afraid of my story. And being in a room with someone else who was not afraid of the things that terrified me most, that was a huge moment of, I don't have to be so afraid of my terrors. And there was, I just, so for me, it's that little moment of kind of the plastic being unwrapped on this little
Mhm.
candy and him popping it in his mouth as, oh, he's not terrified. Maybe that means I don't have to be quite as afraid. At least I don't have to be afraid of my terrors in
Right.
the same
Well,
way.
and
So that,
even this idea in the moment of I'm not alone and I'm not too much.
yeah,
I think that for a lot of people who come through Faithful and True, they're so afraid that in somebody hearing their story, they're actually going to be rejected and they're
that's right.
going to be alone. But there's also that fear that what I've done or what I've experienced is too much, and the people around me are not going to be able to handle it. And what's true is for a lot of people, they start telling their friends or they get exposed, and somebody at the church finds out. And for the people in those situations, maybe they don't know what to do with the story. They do overreact. They do communicate your stories too much. And so it's so
Right.
reassuring. We still have that fear. But one of the things that helps us navigate fear is truth. And in that moment, your truth was, I'm not alone. And the truth is, my story is not too much for Mark.
Yeah. And some of the ways I think about it is so when you talk about fear of being crushed or fear of being rejected, if any of our listeners are familiar with attachment theory and language, there's or boundary language, right? The fear of invasion, that it's
Mhm.
going to come at me and crush, or the fear of abandonment, that I'm going to be left alone, that rejection. And both of those are actually functions of not living in what is true. What is true is that God is holding on to me,
Mhm.
and I might not feel it. What was true in that moment, Mark is there for, and that just being confronted with that truth that was outside of me helped me kind of take a step back because I think we'll go to biblical ideas. I think when John says perfect love casts out fear, he's talking about these disordered forms of fear. So the for the believer, for the fear of punishment is what he mentions right after that. This fear of being crushed or being abandoned, and church theology, they'll talk about divine judgment as one or the other, or sometimes both.
Mm.
And abandon hope is what Dante says, all you who enter here, because uh, divine judgment as God stepping away. And perfect love casts out this kind of fear. I don't have to be afraid of being crushed. I don't have to be afraid of being abandoned. Now, that doesn't mean there's no appropriate fears, doesn't mean it means those kinds of disordered fears don't have to run my life. And Mark embodied that for me. And that's so much of what I love about the work we get to do is we get to walk into the minefields where the bomb has gone off, the mines have exploded, and people are looking around at all the damage that gets done and wondering, how in the world can I survive this? And all of that fear. And we get to play this small role of saying, well, let's look at the fear.
Right.
Let's embody courage and we can face into it together.
One thing
And
about
one
that, one thing
one
about
of
that
Mark's,
perfect,
oh, I'm sorry, Greg, go ahead.
one of the thing about that perfect love is sometimes we hear that and we go, oh my gosh, I have to love perfectly in order for there to be no fear. And the reality is, I don't think that's necessarily an invitation for us to love perfectly. I don't think perfect love is what we do. I think perfect love is what we experience in the personhood of Jesus, that Jesus is perfect love. And so, in some way, when we show up or experience the embodied Jesus as perfect love, that is when our fear is cast out. It's that truth of Jesus's perfect love that allows us to move towards and move through and move beyond our fear.
That's right.
What I was going to say is I always appreciated one of Mark's many meaningful sayings is, uh, there is no sin that God is unwilling to forgive us.
Yeah.
So when you're the new guy walking in the door at Faithful and True, and you're carrying in all of your guilt and shame, and as you so beautifully explained it, when you sat down with Mark and he calmly listened to all of it, he knows, and let me reassure you that there is no sin that God is unwilling to forgive you.
Yeah. Yeah. Which didn't mean I never experienced fear. And that's Greg, I love sometimes I'll say, there's no fear in love, but there's lots of fear in the lover. That's
Mhm.
I am not perfect love. I'm called, and so I'm allowed to have that. And actually, again, I want to circle back and say, well, if I did not have fear, that would be an expression of insufficient love in a world like ours, a world where sin and death wreaks havoc. Fear is appropriate. Now, what we do with that fear is really important. Pat Carnes, he's not one for subtle statements. And he has a line where he says, all of recovery and therapy is about coming to terms with fear. All of it is about coming to terms with fear, not getting away from it, not running away so that I'm never afraid. It's about knowing what to do with it, coming to terms with it. And I think Thomas Aquinas would actually say, yeah, that's
Well, yeah, and I would even
true.
expand that. I think all spirituality, that movement towards God, the working out our salvation with fear and trembling, is about moving towards the fear because fear is what paralyzes us. Fear is what holds us hostage. It's the
That's right.
lies of fears that this is too much, or I'm too much, or God is not enough. It's those lies of fears that a fear that hold us hostage. And I think fear is one of the things that's incredibly challenging to navigate because for most of us, we do have fear about our fear. It's the Roosevelt
Mhm.
statement of we only have to fear of fear itself. But what's true is we fear our fear because we see the intensity and we see what is at stake. And our fear is that if I move towards this, if I choose this, if I engage this, it's going to cost me, and that cost is going to be too much. So, when men come to Faithful and True and we start talking about what their recovery is going to look like and what it's going to take, that fear can surface of, oh my gosh, it's going to cost me so much. I'm going to have to give up these things. I'm going to have to give up my image. I'm going to have to give up these secrets. I'm going to have to give up this perspective or this thinking. And so we get afraid of the cost, and that's what causes us to back down. And what one of the consequences of fear moves us to live a very small life.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's so I'm going to expand on that a little if that's okay. I think fear in itself doesn't move us. Fear is that emotion that we experience that drives us to move somewhere. And so, again, in theological language, Thomas Aquinas would say cowardice is actually fear moving us away from what's true.
Mhm.
Cowardice is moving us away from what's true. So we escape into fantasy. And on a battlefield, I'm running away uh, with this fantasy world, like it will still be okay, or I'm insufficiently loving. I love my life more than I love what I ought to love. There are greater things to love than this. And so cowardice is actually letting fear move me away from what's true, away from what's real, away from what's worth loving rightly. While courage is the thing that when I feel fear, I move towards
Mhm.
what's true and towards what's real. Courage isn't absence of fear. Courage is letting what's true be true, as you love to say, Greg, letting what's true be true and standing, knowing that it's true,
Right.
standing, saying, I can walk towards what's real. Um, and so fear is that it gives us a moment of choice. And when I'm afraid of fear, I move towards what they used to call cowardice. So I move away from what's true, away from what's real, away from the things truly worth loving. And courage moves me towards what's real, towards what's true, towards what's really worth loving. And fear is the thing that is in the middle that we have to act upon.
What's interesting is using that perspective, then addiction is cowardice
Addiction
because
is pure coward. Uh,
addiction is about
that's right.
avoiding what is true, what is pure, what is good, what is transformative. It's living in the lie that my addiction can rescue me and save me.
That's right.
And recovery is courage because recovery is moving towards what is true about me, what is true about God, what is true about a circumstance, and letting that truth set me free. And
Right.
so understanding that when we are in that place of fear, we do have a choice.
That's
And
right.
so in recovery, there will be fear. And the goal of recovery is not to live free from fear. The goal of recovery is to steward our fear in such a way that it does move us towards whatever it is that we've been avoiding.
That's
You know,
right.
we often joke that, a, a recovery is moving towards the pain or the parts of our life that we've been avoiding. And we typically don't put that in the brochure because that's not very invitational. But the reality is that is recovery. Anything in my life, whatever the pain is, whatever the fear is, whatever the chaos is, it's actually moving towards that and moving through it and moving beyond it. It's then on the other side of that that we begin to
That's
experience
right.
freedom.
That's right. And um, to quote Thomas Aquinas is I'm a big fan of his. I
He's
know.
your guy. I
He's
get it.
He's
he's like our second guest on the
I
show
know.
today.
I wish we could have. He was called the dumb ox, which right there that endears me to him. You know, if you go by the dumb ox, I'm probably going to like you. So he says the chief activity of courage is not so much attacking as enduring. Which I love this because in recovery, take this little boy who's afraid of rejection. Well, it hurts. It hurts to be rejected. And if my son comes to me and says, I'm really afraid of these friends rejecting me, I'm not going to say, well, don't be afraid of that. Just say, well, you're being accepted and included as a thing worth loving. Like fear springs from love. That's wonderful. Let me hold you because
Mhm.
I will walk with you. You can endure even if there's rejection. So the act of courage, there's a key component of it is the willingness to be vulnerable, to be able to be hurt, to be able to be wounded, and to know there are truer things and realer things than this in this moment, and resting ourselves. So it's that work of enduring is just as much, or even the chief activity, what Thomas says, the chief activity of courage is that enduring. Um,
Well, one thing about that image with your son, and part of what's true is, and you cannot protect your son from rejection.
right. Oh,
And
which is
as
so
parents,
hard. I want to protect my son
yes,
from
as
We
parents,
all
rejection.
that's
do.
absolutely what we want to do. So we can't protect our child from rejection. We can be with our child in the rejection.
That's
And I
right.
think that that's the images of the image of the scripture is this idea that God doesn't protect us and intervene, and God doesn't always rescue, and God is always with us when we are experiencing being crushed or being rejected. And that's where we find hope is God's capacity to be with us.
That's
Well,
right.
I think this is probably a good time to bring this to a conclusion because in our next podcast, we can talk more about what courage is. We've talked
Mhm.
a lot in this one about fear, and I hope that it's kind of prompted you in your thinking as you've listened to this. But also, we'll continue the conversation in the next podcast about what courage is, how we find courage, and the role of courage in our recovery.
That'll be great. Josh, thanks so much for being with us today. This is a great subject, and you've got a great perspective on it. We appreciate you being on the podcast today.
All right.
We'd also like to thank all of our listeners and viewers for joining us on the Faithful and True podcast today. We hope that today's message has really touched you in a meaningful way. We feel that a lot of times we have people turning to our podcast for guidance, direction, and motivation. And if you're an individual who has heard today's message, who understands the fear and starts to get a glimpse of the courage that it'll take, we hope that you'll visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find numerous other podcasts like this one, in fact, hundreds of them, to give you guidance and direction, as well as all of the information and online registration for our 3-day intensive men's journey workshops that we offer every month. We also have the women's journey workshop that we do about 3 times a year. And we now have 2 different couples journey workshops. And all the information about those events are on our website. So we invite you to check that out. Give us a call, or if it's a men's or women's workshop, you can register right online. Until then, we hope that this coming week will be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.